The Age of Fire and Kings. The fire crackled in the heart of the village, casting flickering shadows on the faces of those gathered. The rishi, a wise priest wrapped in saffron robes, raised his hands, chanting hymns that seemed as old as time itself. His voice rose with the smoke, carrying words of power, words that had never been carved onto stone but lived on in memory. The Vedas. Among those seated was Anaya, no longer a child, but a woman who had seen her world change. The land she once knew, the land of her ancestors, the builders of Mohenjo-daro, was now a distant memory. The great stone cities had crumbled, their secrets buried beneath sand and time. Now, the Aryans ruled the land, and their stories were no longer written on seals. They were sung. Agni, the fire, the messenger of the gods, the rishi intoned. Anaya's father leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. These hymns will never be forgotten, Anaya. They are the voices of the gods. But Anaya wondered, what of the voices of her people? The gods of the Indus, the silent builders of the past, had they already been forgotten? The flames danced as the rishi continued his prayers, but in the distance, beyond the fire's glow, the world was changing. New rulers were rising, new kingdoms were forming, and war was on the horizon. The rise of the warriors. The Aryans were not just priests and herders, they were warriors. They rode across the plains on swift horses, their iron swords glinting in the sun. Once they had been wanderers, but now they spoke of land, power, and kings, rajas who ruled with strength and wisdom. One such warrior was Arjun, a leader who spoke not of peace, but of conquest. The land must be ruled, he declared to those who would listen. The strong must lead, and the weak must follow. Anaya watched as power shifted. In Mohenjo-daro, merchants and elders had led through trade and wisdom. Now, Kshatriyas, warriors, stood at the top. The Varna system was taking shape. Brahmins, the priests, who spoke to the gods. Kshatriyas, the warriors who ruled. Vaishyas, the traders and farmers. Shudras, the workers who served. But there was no place for Anaya's people. The builders of the past had become the forgotten ones. Some adapted, learning the ways of the Aryans. Others fled south, carrying their traditions with them. And what of us? Anaya had once asked. No one answered. The old ways were fading, and the fire of the Aryans burned ever brighter. The kingdoms of the Ganges. The rivers had guided them, just as they had guided the Indus people before them. But now, the Aryans had moved east, toward the plains of the Ganges, where the soil was rich, the forests thick, and the waters endless. Here, the small, wandering tribes of herders and priests began to settle, growing into something greater, kingdoms. The land was different from the dry plains of the Indus. The Ganges was a living goddess, flowing endlessly through vast jungles. The forests hummed with life, elephants roamed freely, peacocks danced in the morning light, and the scent of wet earth after the monsoon rains filled the air. But where there was land, there was war. One evening, as the village gathered around a fire, a messenger arrived, his horse covered in dust from travel. The Raja calls for all able-bodied men. A war is upon us. Anaya's heart clenched. War? Who were they fighting? Her husband, once a simple farmer, now held a bow and arrow. The peaceful days of trading by the river were fading. The kings, the rajas, were no longer content with ruling their own villages. They wanted more land, more cattle, more power. And so, the first great kingdoms of India began to rise. And the birth of the epics. The sound of drums echoed in the halls of the king's court. The firelight flickered on the walls, where warriors sat cross-legged, their weapons at their sides. A bard, dressed in simple robes but carrying the weight of centuries in his voice, stood before them. He took a deep breath and began. There was once a great prince named Rama. Anaya's grandson, Keshava, sat in the shadows, his eyes wide with wonder. This was how history was remembered now, not through silent seals, not through the walls of crumbling cities, but through stories. The bard's voice rose and fell, bringing to life the tale of Rama and Sita, of exile, of war, and of Dharma, the path of righteousness. The warriors in the hall nodded solemnly, for they knew that this was not just a story, it was a lesson. Elsewhere, in another kingdom, a different bard sang of a great war between two families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. It was a tale of betrayal, of duty, of gods guiding men into battle. And so, on the field of Kurukshetra, Arjuna stood with his bow, torn between war and righteousness. This tale, the Mahabharata, would be passed from generation to generation, growing larger with each telling, until it became the longest epic in history. The sacred words one evening, beneath the cool shade of a banyan tree, Anaya saw something remarkable. A young Brahmin was writing. For years, the Vedas had only been spoken, never written. But now, on palm leaves and birch bark, the sacred words were being recorded. "We must not forget," the Brahmin murmured, dipping his reed pen into ink. Anaya watched in silence. She had once lived in Mohenjo-daro, where scribes had carved symbols onto seals. Now she saw a new script being born, Sanskrit, the language of the gods. One day these stories would shape a civilization. They would teach kings how to rule, warriors how to fight, and people how to live. Keshava leaned closer to his grandmother. "Are these stories true?" Anaya only smiled. "Truth is not always in what happened, my child. Sometimes it is in what we choose to remember." But deep down she knew. These stories would outlive them all. The Indus had fallen, the Aryans had risen, and the fires of history would burn forever.